For 3 months in the winter of 2022, I lived alone in my late grandparents' house just outside Hollow Creek, Pennsylvania. It wasn't by choice. My lease had ended unexpectedly after the apartment building I was staying in was sold to some property company that wanted to renovate everything. They gave all tenants 30 days to move out. I didn't have enough saved for another place right away, and my parents suggested I stay at the old family house until I figured things out. Technically, the house belonged to my mother and her sister now, but neither of them wanted anything to do with it. It sat at the end of a quiet, dead-end road surrounded by towering maple trees, about 15 minutes outside town. The place had been empty for almost 2 years. Nobody wanted to sell it because of sentimental reasons. Nobody wanted to live there because the house was ancient. So it just sat there, waiting. I remember pulling into the cracked gravel driveway the first evening with my car packed full of boxes and feeling this heavy unease settle over me. The house looked exactly the same as it had when I was a kid. Tall, white siding, yellowed with age, black shutters, a wide porch with sagging steps. Half the windows reflected the sunset like dark mirrors. The other half looked empty, watching. It sounds ridiculous now, but even before stepping inside, I got this weird feeling that the place had been expecting me. Still, free housing is free housing, and when your bank account is hanging by a thread, creepy vibes become easy to ignore. The first few weeks were uneventful. I worked weekdays at a hardware distribution center in Hollow Creek and spent my evenings trying not to think about every groan and creak the house made after dark. Old houses are noisy. They settle. Pipes knock. Wood expands and contracts. That's what I kept telling myself. Eventually, I adjusted. The strange sounds became background noise. I even started appreciating the isolation. No neighbors close enough to bother me. No rent. No distractions. Then came the conversation with Mrs. Kessler. She lived across the road in a small brick ranch house and had known my grandparents for decades. Sweet woman, probably late 70s, always outside trimming hedges or sweeping her driveway. She'd occasionally wave when I came home from work. Sometimes she'd bring over muffins or ask how I was settling in. One cold Thursday evening in February, I was checking the mailbox when she shuffled over in her thick winter coat. There was something different about her expression, tense, concerned. "Ethan," she said, lowering her voice, "I need to ask, are you expecting company?" I frowned. "No, why?" She glanced toward the house, then back at me. "This afternoon, I saw someone moving around upstairs." That made me laugh nervously. "Probably just shadows." She shook her head. "No, honey, I know what I saw. A man." The word landed strangely. "A man?" She nodded. "Tall, moved past the guest room window. I thought maybe you'd come home early, but then I noticed your car was gone." I looked toward the house. All the upstairs windows were dark. Still. I forced a smile. Probably sunlight playing tricks. But she didn't smile back. "You should check." I thanked her and headed inside, trying to brush it off. Still, her words lodged themselves deep enough to make me uneasy. The first thing I did was search the entire house. Living room, dining room, kitchen, basement, both upstairs bedrooms, bathrooms, closets. Nothing. No broken locks, no open windows, no signs anyone had been there. I even checked for muddy footprints. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself she'd mistaken shifting shadows for movement. The house had huge old windows that reflected weirdly when the sun hit them at certain angles. That had to be it. I made dinner, watched TV, forgot about it. At least for a while. By midnight, I was finally heading upstairs to bed. And that's when everything changed. The second floor layout was strange. At the end of the hall was the master bedroom where I slept. Connected to it was a narrow dressing corridor with an old built-in vanity and closet space. Beyond that was a massive, outdated bathroom. The dressing corridor had one ceiling light, an ancient bulb encased in frosted glass with a pull string hanging down. I had never used it, not once. The thing looked like it belonged in a museum. To turn it on, you had to yank the string hard enough to hear the mechanism click. That's why when I stepped into my bedroom and noticed a pale bluish glow spilling from that corridor, my blood ran cold. The light was on. I froze. For several seconds, I just stared. There was no explanation. I hadn't touched it. No one else should have been there. Slowly, I approached the corridor's entrance. The glow made the narrow space feel unnaturally long. At the far end, the old bulb hummed faintly. I reached up and grabbed the string. It took a hard pull to switch it off. Definitely not something that could happen accidentally. Darkness swallowed the corridor again. And just like that, Mrs. Kessler's warning came rushing back. A man moving upstairs. I stood there listening. The house was silent. Too silent. Every instinct told me to leave right then, drive somewhere else, call the police, do something. Instead, I did what most people do when reality starts brushing against something terrifying. I rationalized. Old wiring, faulty switch, coincidence, anything except the truth my gut was screaming. I turned my bedroom light back on and sat on the bed scrolling mindlessly through my phone. But I couldn't focus. Every few seconds, my eyes drifted to the bedroom door, to the dark hallway beyond, waiting, listening. After half an hour, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. If someone really had been inside, they'd have made noise, shown themselves, done something. Still, the unease wouldn't go away. Finally, I decided to check the house one more time, just to settle my nerves. I stepped into the upstairs hall. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet. The guest room door stood slightly open across from me. That was odd. I always kept it shut. I couldn't remember opening it earlier. A knot tightened in my stomach. Slowly, I crossed the hall and pushed the door wider. Moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating the old room. Dusty furniture, stacks of cardboard boxes, my grandparents' antique dresser, and the bed. At first, I didn't notice anything wrong. Then I saw it, a shape beneath the blankets, human-sized, perfectly still. For one split second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then the figure sat upright, fast, violently fast. The blankets dropped. A man stared at me from the bed. He was gaunt, unshaven, dark hair hanging over hollow eyes. And judging by how instantly he moved, he hadn't been asleep. He'd been lying there awake, listening, waiting. My breath caught in my throat. The floorboard beneath me groaned, and his expression changed. Not surprise, not confusion. Recognition, like he'd been expecting this exact moment. Then he lunged forward, and I ran. I bolted down the hallway so fast my shoulder slammed into the wall hard enough to send a framed photo crashing to the floor behind me. But I didn't stop to look back because I could already hear him pounding after me, his footsteps heavy and frantic against the old wooden floorboards, each step closer than the last. I practically threw myself down the staircase, missing the final 3 steps and crashing into the front hallway table, knocking over an old ceramic lamp that shattered across the floor. Behind me, I heard him hit the stairs, not even trying to be quiet anymore, and that was when pure survival instinct took over. I yanked open the front door and sprinted into the freezing February night without my coat, keys, or phone, my socks slipping on the porch steps as I nearly fell. I tore across the gravel driveway toward Mrs. Kessler's house, screaming for help so loudly my throat burned. Porch lights flicked on up and down the road as I pounded on her front door. She opened it almost immediately, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside without asking questions. I remember collapsing onto her entryway floor, gasping so hard I could barely speak, managing only to choke out, "There's someone in the house." She locked her door and called 911 while peeking through the curtains. At one point, she sucked in a sharp breath and whispered, "He's outside." I forced myself up enough to look. Standing near the edge of my grandparents' driveway, half lit by the weak yellow street lamp, was the man from the guest room. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, staring directly at Mrs. Kessler's house. Even from across the road, I could make out how unnaturally still he was, like he hadn't chased me moments earlier, like he'd simply known I would end up there. Then, slowly, he turned and walked around the side of the house into darkness. The police arrived within 8 minutes, though it felt like an hour. They searched the property thoroughly, inside and out, but he was gone. What they did find made everything worse. In the basement, concealed behind a warped shelving unit, was a narrow crawl space my family never knew existed. Inside it were blankets, empty food cans, water bottles, a flashlight, and several old notebooks. The man had been living there. Not for days, for weeks, maybe longer. There was evidence he'd rigged parts of the house to monitor movement upstairs using fishing line threaded through vents and wall gaps. He had a clear view into multiple rooms through small drilled openings hidden behind furniture and air grates. He'd been watching me the entire 2 months I lived there. The police later identified him as a drifter named Caleb Mercer, a transient with prior arrests for breaking and entering across 3 states. He was never caught. Apparently, he'd been squatting in vacant homes for years, choosing properties isolated enough that owners rarely noticed signs of occupation. The officers believed he likely slipped out through an old storm cellar exit while they were securing the front. What disturbed them most was that nothing had been stolen. He hadn't been there for valuables. He'd simply chosen the house because it was empty until I arrived. And instead of leaving, he stayed hidden. Thinking back, there were signs. Food missing that I blamed on my own bad memory, doors slightly ajar, the occasional sound of footsteps overhead that I convinced myself was settling wood. Once, I even woke up to find the kitchen faucet dripping after I knew I'd turned it off. I ignored every warning because none of it made enough sense to confront directly. I moved out the very next morning and never spent another night there. My parents sold the property within 3 months at a loss just to be rid of it. Sometimes I still think about the light in that dressing corridor, the effort it took to pull that string, the deliberate act of him switching it on, knowing I'd notice, almost like he wanted me to know I wasn't alone in that house anymore. What haunts me most isn't seeing him sit up in that bed. It's the realization that if I hadn't checked that guest room when I did, if I'd just gone to sleep and convinced myself everything was fine, I have no idea what might have happened later that night. I've driven long distances most of my adult life, partly because of work, partly because I hate flying, and partly because I've always found something calming about being alone on the road with nothing but headlights stretching into darkness. There's a certain peace to it. The hum of tires, the endless lines of asphalt, the feeling that, for a few hours, the world has narrowed down to just your car and whatever lies ahead. That peace was shattered for me on the night of October 14th, 2023. Even now, almost 2 years later, I can't drive isolated highways after midnight without replaying every second of what happened. This took place on Briarwood Highway, a desolate stretch of road cutting through eastern Tennessee. If you've ever driven through that area, you know what I mean when I say there's nothing out there. No major towns, no rest stops for miles. Just dense forest, occasional broken fences, and the kind of darkness that feels almost physical. I'd been visiting my parents in Hawkins Ridge, about 7 hours north of where I lived in Georgia. It wasn't exactly a fun trip. My father had recently undergone surgery, and while everything had gone fine, I'd spent 3 emotionally exhausting days helping around the house. By the time I left Saturday afternoon, I was already drained. Still, I wanted my own bed, my own apartment. So despite my mother insisting I stay another night and leave in the morning, I hit the road around 4:30 p.m. At first, the drive was uneventful. The weather was clear, traffic was light. I grabbed coffee around sunset and felt alert enough. But by midnight, somewhere deep in eastern Tennessee, exhaustion was starting to hit. That heavy kind of fatigue where your eyes keep unfocusing for half seconds, where every mile marker starts looking the same. I rolled down my windows for cold air, turned the music louder, smacked my own face once or twice. Nothing helped. I needed caffeine, badly. The problem was, Briarwood Highway isn't exactly lined with 24-hour gas stations. For nearly 40 minutes, there was nothing. No exits, no signs of life, just trees. Then finally, I saw it. A faded green sign illuminated by my headlights. Exit 214, Briarwood Crossing. Below it, in smaller, peeling white letters, gas, food, lodging. Relief washed over me. I took the exit. The road curved sharply into the woods. No streetlights, no visible buildings, just a narrow two-lane road disappearing into blackness. For a moment, I wondered if I'd taken a wrong turn. Then I saw the gas station, and immediately something felt wrong. It sat alone in a clearing about 100 yards off the road. The place looked ancient, like something frozen in the late 70s. Two rusted fuel pumps stood beneath a cracked metal canopy. The convenience store itself was a squat rectangular building with yellowed windows and faded signage reading Moro's Fuel and Mart. The strangest part was the lighting. There almost wasn't any. No bright canopy lights, no glowing sign, only a weak amber glow spilling from a couple dusty bulbs near the entrance. Honestly, it looked abandoned. If not for the cars parked outside, I would have assumed it was closed. There were 4 vehicles, 2 pickup trucks, a black sedan, an older white van. That was enough to convince me it must still be operating. I parked beside the pumps and killed the engine. The silence hit immediately. No traffic, no insects, no wind, nothing. The kind of silence that make your ears strain for sound. I got out and headed for the entrance. As I approached, the grimy glass reflected my headlights behind me, making it impossible to see inside. I reached for the handle and pulled. The door opened with a long metallic squeal, and every person inside turned to look at me. Instantly, all at once. There were 5 men scattered around the store, 1 near the empty soda coolers, 2 standing by the far wall, another leaning against the counter, the 5th closest to the back. They all stopped moving the exact second I entered. Their faces were hard, weathered, expressionless, and they were staring at me with a kind of intensity that made my stomach tighten. Then I noticed the shelves. Empty. Every single one. No snacks, no drinks, no merchandise, nothing. The coolers were unplugged. The cash register was gone. Even the cigarette display behind the counter was bare. It wasn't a gas station anymore. It was an empty shell. And yet these men were standing inside like they belonged there, watching me. No one spoke. No one moved. For maybe 6 or 7 seconds, we just stared at each other. Then the man by the counter took 1 slow step forward. That was enough. I backed out immediately, let the door slam shut, walked quickly to my car without running. The moment I got inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. All 5 men had moved to the front windows, still watching. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the highway. At first, I tried rationalizing it. Maybe they were contractors. Maybe the place was privately owned and under renovation. Maybe I'd interrupted some kind of meeting. Weird, sure, but not necessarily dangerous. That's what I told myself. 10 minutes later, headlights appeared behind me. 1 set, then another, then another. They were coming fast. I was already doing about 75. The first vehicle closed the distance in seconds, a black sedan. It swung into the passing lane and accelerated beside me. For a moment, it matched my speed. Then it surged sharply in front of me, too sharply. I had to brake. Before I could react, a pickup truck flew up behind me, close enough that its headlights flooded my mirrors. Another vehicle pulled alongside my passenger side, the white van. My chest tightened. This wasn't random. They had followed me. I sped up. So did they. The sedan ahead brake-checked me hard. I jerked the wheel and barely avoided rear-ending it. The truck behind stayed inches behind my bumper. The van held position beside me. They were boxing me in. Panic hit full force. I remember my hands shaking so violently on the steering wheel that I could barely keep control. I searched desperately for another exit. Nothing. Just forest. Dark, endless forest. The sedan slammed its brakes again, this time harder. I had no choice. I yanked the wheel right and veered off the highway. The car bounced violently as it hit gravel and tore down a narrow maintenance path cutting into the woods. Branches scraped both sides of the vehicle. The suspension screamed, but somehow the car kept moving. Behind me, headlights followed. At least 2 vehicles, maybe more. That was when I realized something horrifying. They weren't trying to scare me. They were trying to stop me. and if they caught me out there in those woods, no one would ever know what happened. I spotted a small clearing ahead. Without thinking, I slammed the brakes, grabbed my phone, threw open the door, and ran into the trees. Behind me, tires screeched, doors opened, voices shouted. Then came the sound of multiple people crashing into the woods after me, and I ran harder than I ever have in my life. I didn't stop running until my lungs felt like they were tearing apart. Branches whipped against my face and arms as I pushed deeper through the woods, the darkness so complete it felt solid, like I was sprinting through wet cement. Every few seconds, my foot caught on roots hidden beneath dead leaves, and each stumble sent a fresh burst of panic through me because I knew if I hit the ground for even a second, they'd be on top of me. Behind me, I could still hear them. Heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Men shouting to each other. The occasional beam of a flashlight slicing through the trees like a blade. They were spreading out, trying to flank me. I didn't dare look back. The forest around Highway 41 outside Cedar Hollow was thick and uneven, packed with old-growth pines and dense brush. During daylight, it was intimidating enough. At 1 a.m, it felt like another world entirely. I kept moving until the sounds behind me started to fade. Eventually, I dropped hard behind a fallen cedar trunk, collapsing into the damp earth while trying to force myself silent. Every breath came out ragged and sharp. I clamped a hand over my mouth. For several minutes, all I heard was my pulse hammering in my ears. Then came the voices. Close. Too close. 2 of them were moving somewhere ahead of me, maybe 20 yards out. I saw him come this way. He couldn't have gotten far. Their voices were low and calm. That was what terrified me most. No panic, no anger, just cold focus. Like this was routine for them, like they'd done this before. A flashlight beam swept across the woods, briefly illuminating the trunk I was hiding behind. I flattened myself against the dirt, barely breathing. The beam lingered, then moved on. One of the men muttered something I couldn't make out. The footsteps gradually retreated. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. Maybe 30 minutes? Maybe an hour. Time stopped meaning anything. The cold from the ground seeped into my clothes, but I didn't dare move. Finally, when the woods had gone completely still, I slowly pulled my phone from my jacket pocket. The screen's brightness felt blinding. I turned it down immediately and opened my Maps app. No signal. Of course. I switched to offline GPS and studied the tiny blue dot marking my location. I'd gone farther into the trees than I realized. The highway was east, about half a mile. I considered calling 911 anyway, but if the call dropped or made noise, it could give me away. So I waited another 20 minutes. Nothing. No voices, no footsteps, no flashlights. Then I started moving. Slowly this time, each step deliberate. The woods were unnaturally quiet, and every rustle of leaves made me flinch. At one point, I thought I heard movement off to my right and nearly bolted, but it turned out to be nothing more than a deer slipping through the brush. Eventually, the trees began thinning. I could see faint moonlight breaking through ahead. The road. Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. I emerged from the tree line about 100 yards south of where I had abandoned my car. At first, I thought the road was empty. Then I saw it. My sedan was still there, half embedded in the ditch among young pines. The other vehicles were gone. No headlights, no movement, nothing. The silence felt wrong, like they'd left too easily. I crouched at the edge of the trees, scanning the road for several minutes. Still nothing. Finally, I stepped out and made my way carefully toward the shoulder. The moment my phone picked up enough signal, I called 911. My voice shook so badly the dispatcher kept asking me to repeat myself. I told her men had chased me into the woods, that they'd tried to trap me on the highway, that something was wrong at the gas station back down the road. She asked if I was injured. I said no. Then she told me officers were on the way. Those 15 minutes waiting alone beside the road felt longer than anything I've ever experienced. Every pair of headlights in the distance made my stomach lurch. I kept expecting those same dark SUVs to reappear. When the sheriff's cruiser finally arrived, I nearly collapsed with relief. Deputy Mercer was a broad, middle-aged guy with a tired face and skeptical eyes. He listened carefully while I explained everything. The gas station, the men staring, the pursuit, the roadblock, the chase through the woods. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he looked toward the highway behind us. Then he said something I'll never forget. "What gas station?" I stared at him. "The one back there, about 10 miles north." He frowned. "There hasn't been a station on this stretch in almost 8 years. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. According to him, the old station near Cedar Hollow had been shut down after a fire years earlier. The building was abandoned, no utilities, no active business, no legal access. A second deputy arrived, and together they inspected my car. Aside from some scraped paint and a bent bumper, it was fine. No signs anyone had touched it. No tire tracks from other vehicles either, though the roadside gravel should have shown something. I insisted they go check the station. They did. I followed behind in the cruiser. When we arrived, my stomach dropped. The lot was empty. No cars, no lights, no people. The station itself looked dead. Boarded windows, a rusted padlock on the front door. The pumps were long gone, leaving only cracked concrete bases. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. But I knew what I saw. The deputy searched the perimeter. Nothing. No footprints, no fresh tire tracks, no evidence anyone had been there. Deputy Mercer's expression shifted from skepticism to concern, not in the way I wanted. He asked if I'd been drinking, if I was overly tired, if I'd taken anything. I told him no. He nodded politely, but I could tell he didn't believe me. By dawn, a tow truck had pulled my car back onto the road. I thanked the deputies and drove the remaining 4 hours home with every light in my car blazing. I didn't sleep for nearly 2 days. For weeks afterwards, I convinced myself exhaustion had caused some kind of waking hallucination. 14 hours on the road, late-night fatigue, stress. Maybe my brain had pieced together something irrational. That explanation worked. For a while. Until 3 weeks later. I was halfway through my shift at the warehouse where I worked when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it. Something made me answer. For several seconds, there was only static. Then a man's voice came through. Low, calm, almost amused. "You shouldn't have stopped." The line went dead. I stood there frozen, staring at my phone. The call log showed no number, just unknown caller. I changed my number the next day, reported it to police. Nothing ever came of it. No follow-up, no trace, no explanation. That was 11 months ago. I haven't driven Highway 41 since. I take longer routes now, even if it adds hours. And every now and then, usually when I'm trying to fall asleep, I think about that gas station. About those men standing perfectly still in that dark, empty building. About the way they all turned and stared the exact second I opened the door. Like they'd been waiting. Like they knew someone would eventually walk in. And sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed inside for even 10 seconds longer.